Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our December 7th, 2020 Zoom meeting. Oh, look, the Derek Maycallin has like a crowd there. I'm a little jealous of that. Hey, y'all. Make sure you're social distancing. Want some proof that you're 6 feet apart there. Okay, I see you're stretching out your arms. That's awesome. Okay, so we're going to begin our meeting as we do all of our meetings by saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So I'm going to step out of the way, and then if everyone will unmute their microphones, and we can begin on my lead. So step out, have my hand over my heart, and we're going to begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, now if you'll go back and mute yourself again, that'd be great. Next, what we're going to do is have our presentation from the Charitable Trust. So I'm going to attempt to share one of these great videos that Angela has created from one of the organizations that we have sponsored. And then Dalton Brandon is going to speak to us about the Charitable Trust.
Hi, I'm Christine Collins, president of CSR Humane Society. We're a local no-kill shelter in the Augusta area. We're not affiliated with any national organizations or any government funds, so we depend on the local community to help us. Any donations we take in go directly to the care of the pets, whether it's food or veterinarian care. At any given time, we have about 90 pets in our possession or in our care, and the money goes to food and vet care.
Okay, Dalton, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Martha. That was Christine Collins, who's president of the CSRA Humane Society. It is our only no-kill animal shelter in this area. They are supported only by local donations and, in my opinion, do God's work with very little for our homeless and often hopeless animals. If you didn't know, they're located in the old jail next to the old Green Jackets ballpark in Lake Olmsted. The Charitable Trust Committee is spotlighting each of the organizations our club supported this year, and the CSRA Humane Society is one. We were also able to support 6 different organizations the year before, that is 2019. We are now in our fundraising period for next year, and our fundraising ends in only about 3 weeks. We are behind in contributions from our membership, probably due to our not meeting in person. We asked this year, as we did last year and the year before, for $100 from 100% of the membership. We're a service club, and this is our primary annual service activity. As one of our members has pointed out in years past, and I'm going to borrow that notion, is that we don't have to sell brooms or onions nor run a fair to raise money to do our service activities as some of the service clubs do. Our task is simple. We ask only for a yearly contribution of at least $100. Since we've reduced our dues, I would hope that each of us could contribute our $100 or a bit more. All of the members of the board and the members of the Charitable Trust Committee have made their pledge to meet or exceed this level. You can contribute by PayPal or check. And either way, please indicate whether you want your contributions to go to local charities, all of which are 5013C organizations, or to scholarships. Where you send your check is in the Kiwanis notes. which I think is P.O. Box 102, Augusta 30903. As you can imagine, local charities have had to reduce certain of their fundraising efforts because of COVID restrictions, and hence their contributions are down significantly. So please, let us all step up and help them in this difficult time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dalton. As Dalton mentioned, we are running a little behind this year, although we did have a flurry of activity for Giving Tuesday, and so we're happy about that. But if you haven't already contributed, please think about doing that. And you can do it, as Dalton said, either to the P.O. Box or to the PayPal link that I've emailed out, and we'll continue to email out through this year. I want to also remind you that we have, it's the board authorized a permanent scholarship in the name of our member Sam Tyson. That is a separate donation fund and has a separate address, and that will also be included in Kwan notes. So just pay attention to that and make sure you know and carefully indicate where you want your donations to go. So as far as our history moment goes, since our speaker is a historian and his topic is the most known event that happened on this day in history, I'm going to keep my own moment very brief. But it is interesting, I think, and should be of interest to a lot of you football fans out there. Instant Replay made its debut 57 years ago on this day, December 7th, 1963, during the CBS telecast of the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. CBS director Tony Verna was the genius behind the idea, but wasn't completely sure if the technology would work even during the game. The system Verna used relied on refrigerator-sized tape decks that weighed nearly 1,200 pounds. It took Verna several attempts throughout the game to get the right footage that the crew could use before it finally clicked. The Army quarterback scored a 1-yard touchdown for the cadets in the fourth quarter. Verna grabbed the footage and played the touchdown at full speed again. Fans watching the CBS broadcast probably thought they had seen the same play twice later in the game. Nelson had to remind confused viewers, this is not live, ladies and gentlemen, Army did not score again. And thus the instant replay was born. Okay, now we are going to do our attendance prize. If you're newly back to our virtual meetings, just letting you know that our attendance prize is a $15 gift certificate to Toast Wine and Beverage. We meet in person. We have a member donate a bottle of wine. Obviously, we can't do that virtually, so we're going to let you go pick out your own bottle of wine. I want to specifically thank our board member, Mark Alberton, for agreeing to help coordinate this part of the meeting. So once we decide who won, he will actually be putting that card in the mail to you all. And I'm realizing that this group of people together, you're just gonna, if you all win, you're gonna have to fight it out, arm wrestle or something to see who's gonna get the prize. So Dr. vanTuyll, if you can pick a number between 1 and 20 for me. You're on, you need to unmute, sorry.
Sorry about that. Yes, I have picked a number. Do you need me to tell you what it is?
Yes, please tell me what it is.
15.
Okay. 4, 1, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, that's Bill Canto. Congratulations, Dr. Canto. You have won our Toast Wine and Beverage gift card, and Mark Alberton will be getting that into the mail to you. Okay, so now.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. It'll make for a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too. Okay, now our President-elect Troy Lanier is going to introduce our speaker, Augusta University's Dr. Hubert vanTuyll.
Today is the 79th anniversary of one of the most consequential dates in the history of our country. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy Air Service launched a surprise attack against the U.S. naval base located at Pearl Harbor, and the attack led to the United States' formal entry into World War II on the following day. It's important that we remember that day and recognize it every year And as far as our club is concerned, I think it's important for us to remember that we had one of our own members who was present there at Pearl Harbor when the attack occurred. General Perry Smith was there as a child and actually remembers some of the events there. To tell us more about Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, is Professor Hubert vanTuyll, and he is in his 30th and final year as professor at AU, Augusta University. He specializes in military and diplomatic history, modern Europe and modern Russia. He's the author or co-author of 7 books. He's married to communication professor Debbie Redden vanTuyll. They have one daughter who is also in education. She's an administrator at Colorado University. Hubert is a native of the Netherlands. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from Montevallo, a law degree from Duke, and a PhD from Texas A&M. And we're happy to have the professor here to tell us more about December 7, 1941.
Thank you, Troy, and y'all, thank you for having me. I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to turn on my screen share so that you can see my slides. Can y'all see that okay now? Okay, thank you. And the second thing I'm going to do is over here on my phone actually start a stopwatch, because as I tell my students, you know what it means when a professor says, I'm going to say a few words, and the answer is nothing at all. And I'd like to get through this quickly enough so that you'll have a chance to ask some questions, make comments, as the case may be. So by way of introduction, why Pearl? There's actually a whole bunch of questions hiding in there. The 2 most obvious ones are, why did Japan do it? And why was the US not better prepared for the attack? And you can't really deal with the second question until you deal with the first one. Why did Japan do it? Now, historians have a bad habit. And that bad habit, you ask a historian a question about anything, the first thing that historian will say is, well, to understand that, you have to step back to whatever event it is. And I'm actually briefly going to take you all the way back to the 1600s. Don't worry, I'm going to skip a lot. But in the 1630s, the Tokugawa rulers of Japan issued a policy, a law of strict isolation. No Japanese out, no foreigners in. But in the 1850s, Matthew Perry, an American naval officer acting on behalf of the government, of course, went to Japan and ordered Japan to stop isolating itself and to open its port cities to foreign commerce. Japan, by the way, was shocked by the modern nature of Perry's ships, and about a decade later, Japan embarked on a massive modernization process, a very successful one, and by the latter part of the 19th century, Japan was becoming a major power in its own rights. It had a series of conflicts with China, but it clearly was militarily superior to China. Now, this matters because the diplomatic friction with Japan began at this point. You had a segment of Japanese opinion that wanted to establish a great power, and the US wanted to prevent China from being carved up into zones of influence or zones of power. So the friction really started already in by the 1890s. Well, it might have just remained a diplomatic exercise, but then something important happened. And the ironic thing about that important thing is it was something that Japan was not involved in any way. That thing was, of course, the Spanish-American War. This war had begun because of an American dispute with Spain about how Cuba was being governed. So, of course, our first big operation took place in the Philippine Islands, which was also a Spanish colony. We conquered the Philippines with help from local insurgents, and then we decided to keep them, which led to a bitter war against those same insurgents. We did that partly for fear that if we didn't take the Philippines, the Japanese might. So you see, the rivalry is building. But more importantly, by doing this, by annexing the Philippines, the United States had moved its military frontier, its strategic frontier, 7,000 miles across the Pacific. But so you ask, in practical terms, how does this connect to Pearl? Well, to understand that, we first have to consider for just a moment why Japan attacked when it did. Why in December of 1941? And here is the situation. You have in Japan a body of opinion, including very powerful people who want to move south and southwest and take the resource-rich areas of Southeastern Asia. Now, consider this. Japan's problem was it faced in this region four powers: Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The United States because of our possession of the Philippines. But in the summer of 1940, France was overrun by the Nazis, so it's effectively off the board. Then Britain is still around, but the British are barely hanging on fighting Hitler, so Britain is no longer a major opponent in Asia, or so the Japanese calculated. And then in June of 1941, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and which meant, of course, that there was no way that the Soviet Union could be involved in East Asian affairs. And all of a sudden, instead of four major opponents, the Japanese only potentially faced one, the United States. So this is what you call in strategic terms a window of opportunity. It seemed like it was a great time for Japan to attack. It wasn't. But the question is, of course, why bother Pearl Harbor at all? Pearl Harbor itself was almost 4,000, and still is almost 4,000 miles from Tokyo. That would be 8 days nonstop steaming for a warship like the Arizona. However, remember what I said about Japan wanting to move into Southern Asia. Those in Japan who wanted to expand the empire assumed and believed, so this is all based on an important assumption, that the United States would never by Japan just bypass the Philippines. In other words, they assumed that if they moved, war with the United States would be inevitable. So they considered, why not strike first and eliminate the Pacific fleet, which of course had moved in the summer to Pearl Harbor. Now, all of this might seem so obvious looking at these pretty little maps, that you ask yourself, well, why was the United States not better prepared? After all, the fact that tensions were rising in the Pacific and elsewhere was not news to us. The Pacific Fleet had been moved to Pearl Harbor precisely because tensions were rising. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt was preparing the United States for war as rapidly as he could. By the way, it's a very interesting contrast if you look at the US before World War II and the US before World War I. For World War II, we were ready. So why was there still surprise? I mean, the tensions in the Pacific were rising ever since Japan had decided in 1937 to conquer China. So my first question would be, sub-question would be, why did the US government not anticipate an attack? And the answer is, they did anticipate it. So the next question would be, why did the government not tell our commanders at Pearl Harbor that war was imminent? And the short answer is, they did. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the two senior officers in Hawaii, twice, first on November 25th and again on December the 1st, they were both warned that war was imminent. So that brings me back to the original question. Why was Pearl Harbor taken by surprise? And I'll add to that that in 1937, the US Navy had actually run an exercise. This is the carrier USS Saratoga. In 1937, the Saratoga was given the job of sailing out from Hawaii and then trying to get back toward the base and attack it. So this was a war game maneuver with the folks in Pearl. Their job was to find the Saratoga. The Saratoga's job was to get its airplanes over Pearl before it was detected. The Saratoga managed to evade all attempts to find it, and so it succeeded in the attack. It got its planes over Pearl. So here are the reasons why there was surprise. Number one, the Pacific is a very big ocean. Well, y'all probably knew that. So it wasn't the question of, well, is there a chance that Japan might strike, but where? Number two, racism. The hatred of the Japanese in America goes back a long way before Pearl Harbor. The Japanese immigrants in California were not popular. And the idea of a Japanese attack goes back at least to 1915, when there was a strong belief in the US that the Japanese were about to seize the Panama Canal. And quite frankly, there was kind of a feeling in some circles that, you know, there's no way that those little yellow whatevers could pull this off. The next reason also has to do with the size of the Pacific Ocean. For the Japanese Navy to go all the way from Japan to Pearl Harbor, its battle fleet would have to stop and refuel twice, on the way there, on the way back. That's just incredibly dangerous. And my final reason is a simple number, 40 feet. 40 feet. The depth in Pearl Harbor, where the battle fleet was anchored, is between 40 and 45 feet deep. Back then, torpedoes had to dive from 70 to 100 feet. In other words, if you dropped a torpedo from an airplane attacking a warship, it would have to dive 70 to 100 feet before it got back up to its design depth. Now, it was an article of faith in all navies that if you wanted to attack battleships, you had to use torpedoes. Bombs alone, very difficult. And the reason that bombs alone wouldn't be likely to do it, it is that if you just drop bombs on top of a battleship, the top of the battleship is the most heavily armored that you can imagine. So a torpedo strikes the weaker parts of the battleship, and more importantly, if you have a battleship on one side and it starts to angle over, of course, its weaponry is eliminated. And what you see here is a diagram of the Oklahoma after it was torpedoed. So you see in 20 minutes, 22 minutes, it was upside down at the bottom of the harbor. Well, how were the Japanese able to do this? It's quite simple. About a year before Pearl, Japanese engineers had invented a better torpedo. The Japanese had invented a torpedo that could go by with a relatively shallow dive and therefore was usable in places like Pearl Harbor. But guess what? They didn't tell us. One final thing. On top of everything else, this is kind of Murphy's Law of War. Pearl had incredibly bad luck. The Japanese planes were picked up on radar, but the radar report was ignored. Also, US planes were expected to come in from that same direction from the north. And finally, General Walter Short, the Army commander, was so afraid of sabotage that he had parked the aircraft close together, with, as a result, you have catastrophic damage. So the attack happens. This shows you, of course, the path of the Japanese fleet from Hitsukapu Bay to Pearl Harbor. Here you see the incoming paths of the first and second waves. American losses are heavy, but only 2 battleships were permanently lost. The Arizona, which was blown up, and the Oklahoma, which was so severely damaged, that it could not be repaired. More importantly, perhaps, out of the 390 military aircraft on Pearl Harbor, 347 were destroyed or damaged. It may have been the most damaging loss at the moment. 2,400 military were killed, including 3 sailors on board the West Virginia, which I think you actually see here. They were trapped in the hull for 16 days, and there was absolutely no way to get them out. 68 civilians were killed, mostly by friendly fire. You know, of course, you have all these warships pouring out shells to try to hit the Japanese airplanes, and all those shells have to go somewhere. So quite a few of them landed in civilian areas. 68 civilians were killed. And one of the ironic things is that most of the dead and wounded civilians were ethnic Japanese whose families had emigrated to Pearl Harbor. Thank you very much. Okay, bear with me. Okay, I think I've unshared now.
Yes, you have.
Thank you.
Okay. Who has questions?
Hubert, this is Dalton Brannon. I don't know if you remember me from the College of Business.
How could I forget you, Dalton?
Okay. That admiral and that general, are they still the ones upon which most of the blame reside now that, you know, the heat of that particular moment is long past? What do historians say about that?
Well, most historians don't really focus too much on either Admiral Kimmel or General Short because, first of all, nothing they could have done could have prevented the attack. And one reason I mentioned the Saratoga story is that the odds of discovering the Japanese fleet, those were low. Short has always, though, continued to receive the blame for the heavy losses in aircraft, and he was terribly obsessed with sabotage. That's why he had the planes parked together as close as possible, because then they were easier to guard. That's actually were destroyed. People tend to give Kimmel more of a pass. Yes, the fleet was surprised at anchor. Of course, here's an interesting reality, well, interesting to me anyway. If the fleet had been at sea and been caught by Japanese naval air, our losses would have been much worse.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, because, you know, the survival rate on most of our warships was high. You know, the Arizona is the one huge exception, and I think most of the fatalities were on board the Arizona.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Don't be shy.
I have a question,
Okay, Gil.
and that is, it is suspected that Roosevelt also knew about the attack, and one of the precipitating factors was the fact that we no longer sold scrap metal to Japan. Are either of those scenarios true?
Well, the second part of it is, what we had done, we had frozen Japan's assets, their financial assets in the US, as a retaliation for Japan's invasion of China. And that was done because Roosevelt was trying to put pressure on Japan to slow its aggression, because Roosevelt was mainly concerned about what was going on in Europe. And he was actually trying to head off a war in the Pacific. But yeah, cutting off Japan's finances means that Japan could not import either iron or oil, because they import a lot of oil from the United States. And of course, that reminded the Japanese of the vulnerability of their country, because it's a natural rich poor resources. As far as Roosevelt goes, knowing about the attack, no. Like most people in the Army and the Navy, Roosevelt realized that it could happen. But let's face it, all Roosevelt's information about the military situation came to him through the military, through the service chiefs. So Roosevelt knew a lot, but he didn't know anything they didn't know, is what I'm getting at.
I have a quick question, sir. This has been a very great presentation. You know, you see movies and Hollywood's portrayal of what happened. And you see, you know, some planes actually getting up and actually taking out some Japanese aircraft. Did that really happen? Did anybody even have a chance? Did we get any birds in the air at that point?
Yes, we did. The Japanese, I don't know the exact, the Japanese lost 20-something planes, and I don't know exactly what the ratio was, but we actually did shoot down some planes. Most of the pilots and so on, of course, were actually physically unable to get to their planes in time, but a few did. So that part,
I've heard that two big mistakes that the Japanese made was not bombing the fuel dump or the shipbuilding yard. Is that true?
yes. They did not, for example, they did not destroy the dry dock. The dry dock was the absolutely essential thing you needed to repair damaged warships. If they had destroyed that, then, you know, the situation would have been far worse. But two things happened. First of all, the officer who was running the dry dock, when the attack began, he showed great presence of mind. He immediately sank the thing. He was able, from the bridge of the thing, to pull all the plugs and let it sink to the bottom of the harbor, which does it no harm, but it's made it less vulnerable to attack. Also, the Japanese failed to launch a third wave. And the commanding Japanese admiral was accused behind his back of cowardice for having failed not to stick around at Pearl and attack again. And for that reason, he was in charge again the following summer at the Battle of Midway, and he stuck around when he should have headed for home. And that's how history is made.
Who else has questions?
Wasn't one of the criticisms of the attack also that you mentioned the dry docks, but there was also a lot of oil storage tanks that were not hit.
That was correct. Yeah.
And would you make a comment about our aircraft carriers that were at sea?
Yeah. The aircraft carriers, there were two aircraft carriers stationed at Pearl Harbor. Those, of course, were both out on maneuvers. This was, of course, one reason why the battleship fleet was at the base, because, you know, it was understood you didn't send the fleet out without any air cover. And that was one of the things that persuaded Vice Admiral Nagumo, he was the Japanese commander, not to stick around for the third wave because he didn't know where the carriers were. He was also afraid of submarines, but carriers were the really big fear.
Any other questions for Dr. vanTuyll?
Can anybody hear me? Perry
Yes,
Smith?
we can.
I'm Perry Smith. Can you hear me?
We can, General.
I hear you, General.
Yeah, I have a couple of points. What if you wanted to do more research into the deal? Which book or two books maybe would you recommend? Would you recommend the books by Gordon Prang and Goldstein, or are there better books or more up-to-date books and more complete books that you would recommend?
Well, I can give you an author. Ed Drea, D-R-E-A. I don't know the titles of his books, but Ed Drea is probably the best guy I've ever met for modern analysis of the Pacific War, including Pearl Harbor, because, well, you know, there are a couple of things that help him. First of all, Ed knows Japanese. You know, an awful lot of stuff gets written about of Pearl Harbor, which kind of acts as if Japan didn't exist. But Ed Drea, who, by the way, is He works for the Pentagon. I forget which service, might be the Army, but he's an in-house military historian. He's really done some of the best works. And he knows, the thing about Ed is he knows all the details about the codes because, of course, you know, what the Navy could read, what the Navy couldn't read, and so forth and so on.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
I have one. Did the Japanese consider this to be a success shortly after, or what? I mean, you're telling us that it could have been worse, that some decisions were made on the Japanese side, and that we had some luck on our side. But did they walk away from this saying, "Hey, we were successful and we did a good job, and we glad we did it"?
Opinion was very divided. You know, the Japanese flying officers who had actually flown and commanded the attack were disappointed. That whole third wave issue. One of those who really demanded another attack was Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, who was the only flying officer, Japanese flying officer at Pearl Harbor to survive World War II. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, after the war, converted to Christianity, became a Baptist minister, and made numerous visits to the United States for religious reasons, but he has a lot to say about it. And the bombing of Tokyo, the Doolittle raid, convinced many Japanese that the American fleet was not sufficiently crippled. So in other words, the window that they were optimistic about the results of the attack was very short. And of course, they knew, of course, that they had missed the carriers. And one comment about the carriers, if I may, very quickly. A lot of people talk about, hey, what about is there anything suspicious about the carriers being out of Pearl on maneuvers? No. For one thing, the total superiority that carriers will have during the Pacific War was not yet known. For example, there was still an argument between the two schools of thought, one that thought that the battleships, etc., would mainly protect the carriers. There was still another school of thought that the carriers with their air cover would allow battle fleets to approach each other and decide things with battleships. So there was nothing really suspicious about them being out of Pearl Harbor. But it was, of course, very fortunate because, as we discovered on many occasions, you know, carriers are spectacular, but they're also extremely vulnerable.
One more question for you, sir. A lot of people said that the Japanese, I've heard that this was just basically to cripple us. They had no intention of invading the continental U.S. Is that true?
They had no intentions of invading the continental United States, period. That was never considered. They did consider attacks on the West Coast, but not with any intention of landing an army and making a conquest or anything like that. And of course, as you're probably aware, they made some little bitty attacks on the West Coast. They sent over flying bombs and incendiaries and then all sorts of things like that. But they never intended to conquer the continental United States. Hawaii, maybe.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. vanTuyll. We really appreciate your expertise and you coming to join us, particularly during finals week at Augusta University. I want to make sure everyone knows that our next meeting will be December 21st, and our speaker there will be Representative Barry Fleming, who will be talking to us about the upcoming legislative session for the state of Georgia. So that will be really interesting and very relevant because as you may have noticed, Georgia has been in the news a lot lately. And so it'd be interesting to see what sort of insights he can share with us about their upcoming legislative session. Then we'll take 2 weeks off for Christmas and New Year's, and then we'll resume our bi-weekly meetings on January 11th. Want to congratulate Dr. Bill Canto again for winning our attendance prize, and then leave you with a final thought for the week. We are fully into the Christmas season, and the Christmas season is obviously a lot different this year than in years past. So I want to share a quote with you from former President Calvin Coolidge. "Christmas is not a time nor a season, but a state of mind. To cherish peace and goodwill, to be plenteous in mercy, is to have the real spirit of Christmas." So as we go through the next few weeks, I hope you're able to find that spirit of Christmas and be able to count our blessings, which for me includes all of you all. I hope that you will have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you back in 2 weeks. And don't forget, as you're feeling generous and full of peace and goodwill, to remember our charitable trust and scholarship to make donations to. Thank you again, Dr. vanTuyll. Everyone have a great week. Stay safe, be careful, and we'll see you soon.